Let's get to Tim Walz, who, just when you think no one's sitting at this table, neither she nor the big white blanket, can embarrass themselves any further, he does. She asks him, to her credit, about the carrying the weapons in war, which we know is a lie. He never served in war. He's been stealing valor for quite some time. And take a listen to this answer.
Say, hey, when there's a problem, you call a man. The Democrats can't even tell you what a man is.
So when you hear Walz brag about how much of a man he is, what does that tell you?
I think there might be a little bit of a cope there, you could say. There's a little bit, he has to remind us how masculine he is, trying to not even be able to load a shotgun or fix a truck.
What happens when the friendly neighborhood politician you see on TV isn't who he seems to be at all? For Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, the image is one of a folksy, down-to-earth teacher who just wants to do right by his people. It's a persona built on approachability and small-town charm, a carefully constructed narrative of a man who understands the common folk because he is one of them. But behind the gentle smile and the Minnesota accent, a trail of shocking fabrications and questionable decisions has come to light, revealing a man who might be a complete stranger to the very people who elected him. This isn't just about political disagreements, it's about a foundation of truth that appears to be crumbling under the weight of his own words.
You said that you carried weapons in war, but you have never deployed actually in a war zone. A campaign official said that you misspoke. Did you?
Well, first of all, I'm incredibly proud. I've done 24 years of wearing the uniform of this country. Equally proud of my service in a public school classroom, whether it's Congress or the governor. My record speaks for itself, but I think people are coming to get to know me. I speak like they do. I speak candidly. I wear my emotions on my sleeves, and I speak especially passionately about our children being shot in schools.
I'll tell you one thing. The most masculine thing that someone can do in America today is stand up for women that are not able to stand up for themselves.
Right.
So while Tim Walz is going on Gavin Newsom's podcast, attacking me, by the way, saying that I'm a bad guy, well, I'm sorry, Governor Walz. One thing that we don't have in common is, unlike you in Minnesota, I, every single day, am actually fighting for female privacy in locker rooms and that women's sports will not have men in them. Real men stand up for women when they're not able to stand up for themselves.
Tim Walz built his entire political brand on being the everyman. He was the relatable high school teacher and football coach from Mankato, a figure who could talk about fiscal policy 1 minute and diagram a football play the next. His persona wasn't that of a polished, lifelong politician, but of a neighbor you could trust. A man who wore his heart on his sleeve and spoke with a simple, secondhand sincerity. This carefully crafted image made him seem authentic, a refreshing break from the usual political doublespeak. Critics, however, soon began to argue that this persona was less of a personality and more of a performance, a costume worn to hide a far more calculating and ambitious operator. They saw an act that screamed consultant-approved nonsense, wrapped in just enough plaid shirts and folksy anecdotes to seem real.
And the idea that you said that you were in war.
Yeah.
Did you misspeak, as the campaign has said?
Yeah, I said we were talking about, in this case, this was after a school shooting, the ideas of carrying these weapons of war. And my wife, the English teacher, told me my grammar's not always correct. But again, if it's not this, it's an attack on my children for showing love for me, or it's an attack on my dog.
This is a sacred trust. In the spring of 2005, Walz walked away from that sacred trust, abandoning his post when he learned of an upcoming Iraq deployment. This is cynical Pubula saying this. He is a coward. According to this Twitter feed, he is a quitter. And every veteran I've talked to thinks that Walz is close to betraying the country by doing it.
The first major crack in this carefully constructed facade appeared when Walz told a dramatic and deeply personal story about his time in China. He claimed to have been there during the infamous Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, a moment of historic violence where the Chinese government brutally crushed a student-led democracy movement. It was a powerful story that suggested he'd witnessed history firsthand, lending him a worldly gravitas. There was just one glaring problem. It was a complete and total lie. When confronted with travel records and facts that proved he wasn't there. Walz was forced to admit he had made it all up. His excuse was bizarre. He didn't issue a somber apology for fabricating a story about a human rights tragedy. Instead, he laughed it off, bizarrely calling himself a knucklehead for the misstatement. For his critics, this wasn't just a simple gaffe. It was a disturbing insight into his character, a willingness to co-opt a moment of profound suffering for personal clout and then dismiss it as a clumsy mistake. But this single jaw-dropping lie was just the tip of the iceberg.
What Walz did is the moral equivalent of a mother dropping off her 5 preteen children at an orphanage in the dead of night so that she could run for Congress. Yes, it is that bad. This was more than just abandoning troops. It also reflects a major personal deficit in his character and makeup. By the way, this is written by a veteran.
And the idea that you said that you were in war, did you misspeak as the campaign has said?
Yeah, I said we were talking about, in this case, this was after a school shooting, the ideas of carrying these weapons of war. And my wife, the English teacher, told me my grammar is not always correct. But again, if it's not this, it's an attack on my children for showing love for me, or it's an attack on my...
Soon, a disturbing pattern of deception began to emerge, particularly surrounding the one area where honor is everything, military service. During a passionate speech about gun control after a school shooting, Walz claimed that he carried weapons in war, a statement clearly designed to give him military credibility and authority on the subject. But once again, the facts got in the way. While Walz served honorably for 24 years in the Army National Guard, he never actually deployed to a war zone. When Megyn Kelly pressed him on this blatant falsehood, he didn't apologize for misleading the public. Instead, he deflected, blaming his bad grammar and the emotions of the moment, treating a serious misrepresentation of his service like a simple typo. To veterans who actually did carry weapons in war, this wasn't just bad grammar, it was an insult. It was a politician attempting to borrow their valor for political gain. But his critics argue that these verbal blunders pale in comparison to his failures in action when his leadership was put to the ultimate test.
Tim Walz then lied about it to run for Congress and acted as if he was on the front lines. And people in Walz's battalion died. People under his supervision died. If Master Sergeant retired Walz could not be trusted to fulfill his duties he had to his soldiers, his unit, and his nation in 2005, how can he be trusted to be vice president in 2025?
What kind of bullshit is that? No, you don't, sir. We don't lie about military service we didn't actually perform, like going to war. We don't steal valor by saying that we had a higher rank in the National Guard than we did. We don't run around saying we served in operating enduring freedom in Afghanistan when we didn't. We don't stand and watch somebody say that we were in combat in Iraq when we weren't.
When Minneapolis erupted in flames during the George Floyd riots, the world watched in horror as the city descended into chaos. Businesses were looted, livelihoods were destroyed, and entire city blocks were burned to the ground. The 3rd Police Precinct was infamously abandoned and torched. In this moment of terrifying anarchy, law enforcement was completely overwhelmed, as the state's governor, Tim Walz, was the one man with the power to restore order by decisively deploying the National Guard. But as the city burned, he hesitated. For days, critics and desperate residents alike saw a catastrophic leadership vacuum. He seemed paralyzed, waiting until the damage was irreversible before finally acting with the full force required. It was a failure of leadership so profound that it left a permanent scar on the city, painting a picture of a man more afraid of political fallout than of actual flames.
Podcast attacking me, by the way, saying that I'm a bad guy. Well, I'm sorry, Governor Walz. One thing that we don't have in common is, unlike you in Minnesota, I every single day am actually fighting for female privacy in locker rooms, and that women's sports will not have men in them. Real men.
Yourself from that clarification. And then here's, two pieces of this that are really, I speak like they do. People are coming to get to know me. I speak like they do. I speak candidly. I wear my emotions on my sleeves, and I speak especially passionately about, and then he goes on to blame it on the school shootings. I guess he was upset about school shootings, so he lied. But stop saying you speak like we do. I speak like regular people.
This leadership by photo op became a recurring theme of his governorship. When the pandemic hit, critics like Charlie Kirk pointed out how Walz's lockdowns seemed to operate with a strange political logic. Small businesses, family restaurants, and gyms were crushed under heavy-handed restrictions, while massive corporations and liquor stores were often allowed to operate with waivers. His policies were described as politics dressed up in a lab coat, designed more to soothe headlines and project an image of control than to follow a consistent scientific rationale. He always seemed to be there for the press conference, sleeves rolled up with a grim face, but when it came to the devastating consequences, kids falling dramatically behind in school, small business owners losing everything, and rising mental health crises, he was often nowhere to be found. For a man who built his career on being a former teacher, the dramatic drop in Minnesota's educational performance under his watch was a particularly bitter irony. Reading and math scores tanked, yet the proposed solutions often felt like more of the same, offering virtual learning and bureaucratic shuffles instead of a real course correction.
The fallout continues for Tim Walz on the disastrous performance he delivered, in particular when it comes to his self-described knuckle-headed behavior, which was just his latest in a series of lies. The reason he resorted to, I'm a knucklehead, was he got confronted with his latest lie that's been unearthed. There's a long list of them. This one was that he was in China when the Tiananmen Square disaster unfolded, when hundreds of people were killed. You know, whether you were in a place where hundreds of people are being massacred by their government.
Again, if it's not this, it's an attack on my children for showing love for me, or it's an attack on my dog.
This took chutzpah. Let's go through it. You said you carried weapons in war, but you've never deployed in a war zone. A campaign official of yours said you misspoke. Did you? Well, I'm proud, incredibly proud of my record. He keeps doing this. Equally proud of my service in the classroom. Did I mention I was a teacher and a coach, an assistant coach? Okay, whatever. But he's more stolen valor. In the classroom, I'm in the classroom. My record speaks for itself. It doesn't, actually. You've put a lot of lies into that record that you've been called out on by service personnel.
The economic fallout didn't go unnoticed either. Charlie Kirk and others lit up Walz's fiscal policies, mocking his ability to drive businesses out of Minnesota faster than a winter snowstorm clears the streets. They pointed to rising taxes and sprawling regulations that created an environment hostile to private sector success. The critique was simple and brutal. Walz's government was great at collecting taxpayer money, but seemed to perform a kind of reverse alchemy, turning gold into potholes. Prosperity, it seemed, meant creating more government jobs while punishing entrepreneurs for daring to succeed. His entire approach to leadership could be summed up in 3 steps: announce a vague plan, dodge accountability when it fails, and hold a press conference that answers none of the real questions. Then came the culture wars, where Walz attempted to play the part of a moderate while enabling radical agendas. Critics called him out for trying to play both sides of every social issue, resulting in the political equivalent of lukewarm soup. He never seemed to lead with conviction, only with calculation. When his party's talking points demanded masking children, he did it. When they told him to pretend crime was a myth, he nodded along like a bobblehead in a windstorm. Charlie Kirk's point was simple. Walz wasn't governing Minnesota. He was managing the Democratic brand in snow boots, answering to his donors and the latest progressive fad rather than the needs of his state's citizens. But for many veterans, all of these political and policy failures, as serious as they were, couldn't compare to the one act that they saw as the ultimate unforgivable sin. The most damning accusation against Tim Walz strikes at the very core of honor, duty, and the sacred bond between soldiers. In 2005, as his National Guard unit, the 1st Battalion, 125th Field Artillery, was preparing for a deployment to Iraq, Walz made a stunning and life-altering decision. Just as his fellow soldiers were getting ready to head into a war zone, he walked away. He retired from his post, ending his 24-year career right before he would have been sent into combat. To his supporters, he had simply completed his service contract, but to critics and many veterans, this was something else entirely. It was seen as the ultimate betrayal, abandoning his unit and his country when they needed him most. One veteran author described the act as the moral equivalent of a mother dropping off her 5 children at an orphanage in the dead of night to advance her own career. They argue it's far worse than stolen valor. It's turning your back on your brothers in arms for your own personal comfort and safety, leaving the men under your supervision to face dangers you chose to avoid. So So who is the real Tim Walz? Is he the well-meaning but clumsy knucklehead who just happens to misspeak about his own life story, from witnessing historic massacres to carrying weapons in war? Or is he a calculating politician who has deliberately fabricated his past, failed catastrophically in moments of crisis, and abandoned his post when duty called? The story he tells the public and the one his record reveals are two profoundly different narratives. One is a tale of a humble public servant doing his best. The other is a story of a man who talks big, acts small, and governs like he's always waiting for someone else to make the first move. It leaves everyone to wonder what else might be hiding behind that friendly, folksy smile.